Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
Mr. Chairman, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Don, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm sober this morning by the living grace of God and the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the nice introduction, because just recently at home I was introduced at a meeting, and the chairman got up to introduce me, and he said, "This evening we have a speaker who has been a delegate to the General Service Conference of Alcoholics Anonymous. He has been a member of the General Service Board of Trustees of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he has been a director of Alcoholics Anonymous' World Services Incorporated. And so we're very fortunate tonight to have one of AA's real has-beens with us, Don. And really, that's not bad when you think of it, because I don't mind being a has-been, because that means I have finally arrived in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, the reason I say that is because Alcoholics Anonymous to me is entirely different to any other organization I have ever known or ever belonged to. Every other organization, you start way down low as a common peasant, and through years and years you finally work up to where you can be somebody, the president or something like that. And then you become really important. And in AA, it's the direct opposite. The most important person at any meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous is the newcomer. And from there, you work your way up to nothing. So I have finally arrived as a nothing in Alcoholics Anonymous. I would like to say happy Mother's Day to all the mothers who are here today. I might be a little different than Ed was. Last night he said he was an atheist. I wouldn't call myself an atheist. I was an agnostic. And the reason I did that, because I don't think atheists have many holidays. And I like holidays. So, to get started, I think of the story. If there are any newcomers here this morning, you wonder what sort of message you're going to hear or what this character is going to say that will be of interest. And you never know what can happen at these meetings. It's like the story of the Roman Catholic priest one day visited a convent. And when he got to the convent, he was met by the Mother Superior, who was all wrought up and distraught and anxious and uptight. And he looked at her and he says, "Good heavens, woman, what's the matter with you?" And she says, "Father, we have a terrible problem in the convent." The good father said, "Why don't you tell me what the problem is, and perhaps I could be of some help?" "No, Father," she said, "this is not a problem of a spiritual nature, and therefore there's no sense even talking to you about it." Well, the priest says, "Now, just a minute. We priests live in the local community, and we have a lot of experience in many areas of life. And it won't hurt you to talk about the problem anyway. What is it?" Well, the Mother Superior said, "The nuns bought a pet." The good father said, "That's wonderful." And she says, "Father, it's terrible." He said, "Why is it terrible?" She said, "Well, this pet that they bought was a talking budgie bird." And the priest says, "That's great." And she says, "No, Father. Do you know all that bird does all day long is sits in a little swing and swings back and forth. And the only thing that bird will say is, 'Root toot toot, I'm a prostitute. Root toot toot, I'm a prostitute.'" Now, the nuns and novices have tried everything to teach this bird to say something else, and she won't do it, and we're just at our wits' end. Well, the good father said, "I told you it pays to talk about your problems, because, you see, I too happen to be a bird lover, and I have 2 talking budgie birds myself down in my apartment in town. And my birds are so intelligent, and they speak so well, that I had a rosary made up in miniature and also a Bible. And my 2 birds are called Clyde and Clive, and all day long Clyde and Clive pray and read the Bible aloud. And the Mother Superior said, "That is unbelievable." He said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take your bird down and expose your bird to my birds, and maybe my birds will teach your bird to say something else." The Mother Superior said, "Wonderful." She ran and got the cage, gave it to good father. He got in his car, went down to his apartment in town. As he walked in the door, he looked up at his cage, and sure enough, there was Clyde and Clive standing in the bottom of the cage, reading the Bible, and they were praying. So he took the nun's budgie out, and he popped it in with his two and stood back to watch. And right away, the nun's budgie got in the top swing, swang back and forth, and says, "Root, toot, toot, I'm a prostitute." And with that, Clyde turned to Clive, and he says, "Clive, you can throw away the beads and book. Our prayers have just been answered." And this is the meaning of Alcoholics Anonymous. So, I was thinking of the story of the Midwestern executive one day who sent a telegram to his Peruvian manager. And in it he just stated, "Please send a head count of the factory and office workers broken down by sex." And immediately a reply came back and said 329 in the factory, 30 in the office, 3 on sick leave, none broken down by sex. Our problem is alcohol. And before going too far, I would like to pay tribute to Al-Anon, because I personally think that was the greatest thing that has ever happened to Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, I have a personal interest in Al-Anon, is because prior to Al-Anon coming into our picture, my wife, I never called her by her proper name. I always called her Angel. I had a nickname for her. And the reason I called her Angel, she was always up in the air, never had a thing to wear, and was always harping on something. But the wonderful people in Al-Anon got her going to meetings, and would you believe they changed her completely? They finally made an earth woman out of her, and so I'm very grateful to Al-Anon for that. Now, when I say an earth woman, she said, "How would an alcoholic ever recognize an earth woman anyway?" So I don't know, but that's it. My story, of course, is not much different to many other people's. Ed did a wonderful job last night of telling you what he did to the United States Air Force, and I did almost a similar thing to the Royal Canadian Air Force. I enlisted in 1940 in the RCAF during the Second World War, and the reason I did that was to get away from it all, because I had some sort of problem. Of course, it wasn't a drinking problem. I'd had problems all along before I ever took a drink. I was raised in an alcoholic home. My father was a practicing alcoholic, and I had a brother 22 years older than me that was an alcoholic. And I grew up with feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, loneliness, anxiety, frustration, fear, defiance, and of course, depression. And I could never understand these things, and I wondered how I could ever get over these feelings. I remember telling my mother one day when my father and my brother were having a fight and a drunken escapade, and I told her that one thing about me, she would never have to worry. I would never take a drink as long as I lived. And of course, I meant that at the time, and yet before I was out of high school, I was drinking. I can still recall my first drink, and of course, that should sound strange to you, a first drink of alcohol. I have no recollection of my first drink of milk, coffee, Coca-Cola, or anything like that. The sex drive is very strong. I don't even have strong recollections of my first sexual experience. About the only thing I can remember about it, I was all alone at the time. However, I vividly recall my first drinking escapade. And looking back now with the hindsight, I know now that I was an alcoholic when I took that first drink, because there were 4 boys. We were over at a girl's house on a Sunday afternoon, and we're going to have something to eat, and she opened the kitchen cupboard, and there's a bottle of gin. Somebody said, "What's that?" And she said, "It's Daddy's gin. Would you boys like a drink?" And we all sort of nudged each other and said, No, sure. And she took 4 tumblers down and poured 4 shots of gin in each one of them and said, "There you go." And so the first one, Jack, he took his, and Oh, he got up and he smelled it and he said, no, he said, that smells terrible. He says, I don't know how anybody could possibly drink that. So David says, I'll try, and he took a little sip and he made an awful face. He said, oh my God, he said, it tastes terrible. And so the third one, David, he took it and made a face. He swallowed it all. And then I decided right there and then that I was going to take this drink and not make a face, just to prove to these two girls there's one man in this outfit. So I took that glass and I bottoms it up, and down it went. And you know, it burned all the way down. I can still recall. It was just terrible. I'm sure my eyes started to water, and I'm convinced smoke came out my ears, and I thought, my God, I've poisoned myself. Isn't this terrible? And all of a sudden it hit bottom and came back, and I got this nice warm glow all over. And suddenly it seemed as if I grew 6 inches tall. And I turned around and I thought, isn't this wonderful? And I turned around at these two little flat-chested girls, and they suddenly looked voluptuous to me. And I knew I had arrived, and I could talk to them. And I thought, this is fantastic. And I could hardly wait to get the next drink. And so there it went from there on. As I say, I enlisted in the Air Force in 1940 to get away from home and all these crazy people that I was subject to. And this was not in any form of patriotism or anything else. I just wanted to get away from home and get to associate with some grown-up men, and maybe they could help me to become a man. And so that was my motivation. I went into pilot training, and of course went overseas in 1941. And you know, during the Second World War, you only had to destroy 5 aircraft and you could become an ace. Well, you're looking at an ace because I destroyed 5 aircraft during the war. The problem was, one was an AT-6, one was a Hawker Hurricane, and 3 were P-40s. They were all our own aircraft. And I know many of my friends and family wondered whose side I was on during the Second World War. I happened to have been shot down on 3 of those occasions in the P-40s, and so, of course, if you're a practicing alcoholic, that is the perfect excuse. I know nowadays they have problems, they call it Vietnam syndrome, and the Second World War, they just call it drunkenness and alcoholism, but that's what we were, and it was not the service that made me an alcoholic. I was an alcoholic before I got in. The service just helped speed up the process a little. And so I can remember going overseas, and at the end of the tour of operations, I moved back to Cairo, Egypt, sent back there to work as a flying instructor with the Royal Egyptian Air Force. At that time, there's a load of nursing sisters moved up from South Africa. They had gone from Canada to South Africa and had come up to Cairo, and they were at a base just outside Cairo. And we're in Canada House one day, and all of a sudden I saw these nursing sisters, and they looked absolutely fantastic to me. And I knew right away, my problem is I had been lonely all these years, and that's what all my grief was about, and why it was I drank to the excesses that I did. I met this girl, and of course, just prior to that, by the way, I had met my sister, who had also joined the Army, and she was over in Italy, and she was a nursing sister also. The problem was she was a commissioned officer, she was a lieutenant, and I was not. I was a warrant officer. And the reason I was a warrant officer is because every time they had tried to promote me during the war, even on the squadron during operations and everything, even prisoners of war got promoted automatically. But I didn't, because every time I was to be promoted, I would go out and get drunk, celebrate a little prematurely, and wind up losing a promotion. I never wanted to admit that to anybody at the time. On my way to go to Cairo, I stopped in Italy for my, or Sicily rather, where my sister was, the number 5 Canadian General, and I asked her to come along with me. I was going to North Africa to Tunis for a little visit, and when the matron says, where are you going? I said, we're going to Malta, because Malta was in the same theater of war. I didn't tell her Tunis, because that was a different theater of war, and people weren't allowed to move from one theater of war to another. But I knew the people on the transport plane, so we flew to Tunis. And when we were in Tunis the first night, everything was going well, but I had decided, here I am with my sister, and she's an officer, I'm a warrant officer, and this is not fair, and it's not right. And besides, all the best bars were in bounds to officers only. So I said, but nobody knows the difference anyway, so I just took off my warrant officer's badges, and I sewed a stripe on my arm, and I became a second lieutenant right away. And so off I went, took my sister out, and we started to live it up until the provost marshal walked in, and he did an card check, and of course he said to me, "You are now under open arrest, and you'll report to my office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, where you'll be placed under close arrest, awaiting a field general court-martial. And you're going to be charged with impersonating an officer, being out of bounds, being drunk, and of course conduct, prejudice to good order, and conduct of the Royal Air Force. In case they missed on the other three, they could always catch you on that one." And so he says, "You can report in the morning at 9 o'clock, where you'll be placed under close arrest." And I thought, my God, this is terrible. And we went back to the little place where my sister and I were staying, and I said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And I thought, this is a terrible injustice. Here I am, a young man. I've just finished a tour of operations and everything else. Now I'm going to wind up in a court-martial. Now what are my family going to think? They think they've got a son that's a hero overseas, and I wind up, I'm going to go to jail. I just know it. And I prayed, and I even got down on my hands and knees, I can recall, at the bedside. I put my elbows in the bed, and my fist clenched under my chin, in true Hollywood style, and I started to pray, "Dear God, please get me out of this mess, and I swear to God I will never take another drink as long as I live." And would you believe I sincerely meant it at that time? The prayer was no sooner finished, and I was still feeling very depressed, and the phone rang, and it was somebody calling. They said, "The provost marshal wants to see you immediately. Come down to the officers' club where he is, and he wants to see you." And right away I said to my sister, "I'm not going to go. I'm going to go AWOL." And she says, "No, you can't." And I said, "You know what's happened now? And they found out that I've taken you from one theater of war into another, and now they're really going to throw the book at me. I'll never get out of jail, so I just think I should take off." And she talked me into not running, but to go down anyway. And so I went down very shaky down the officers' club, and she went with me. And we met the provost marshal, and I stood there shaking, and I just knew it was going to be the end. And he had a telegram in his hand, and he stood there, and he had this thing tapping in his hand. He says, "Nicholson, I want to tell you that right now you have to be the luckiest man in the whole of the Royal Air Force." And I could barely get the words out, and I said, "Why is that, sir?" He said, "We just received this telegram from Air Ministry an hour or so ago." And he said, "You have been commissioned." It was backdated a number of months. "So in view of this, we'll just drop this thing tonight." And you know, I couldn't believe my luck. And right away I changed like that, and I said, "Sir, could I buy you a drink?" And he said, "Yes, you certainly could." And so in I went, and I started all over again. This has been 30 minutes of coming off my knees, swearing I would never drink again as long as I lived. But I knew I had all kinds of problems. They say I wound up in Cairo, and I met this other nurse. And so right away I thought, my problem is I am single. And what I'm the kind of an individual that needs a lot of responsibility, and I've had none. So if I could get married and have some children, that's all I would need to settle down and smarten up and straighten out. And so I asked this young lady to marry me, and she said, well, in a moment of weakness, she said, "Well, okay." People have said to me since in our group, you know, they said, "How could Norma have lasted that long?" Because we've been married ever since, by the way. It's been some 43 years. And I said, "Well, to tell you, it was just pure luck. And besides, she had extra training to be the wife of an alcoholic." And they said, "How was that?" I said, "She worked in the psychiatric ward of an Army hospital, and she had 56 McNoon patients, and so it was just a natural setup for her to marry a drunk. She felt right at home with them." And so I told this woman that once we were married, everything would be okay, that if we could have married children, everything else. So we went to Alexandria on our honeymoon, and I was got drunk on our honeymoon. The next morning, she was looking down at me, shaking her head, said, "Donald, I don't understand what's the matter with you." I said, "There's nothing the matter with me." And she said, "Well, you said you were going to stop drinking when we got married." I said, "No, not when we got married. when we get back home. But I said, you know, we're overseas now. I might as well finish off sowing my wild oats. But when we get back home, don't worry. We'll have children, and that's all I need, that responsibility. So we got back home a short time later, and of course I was still drinking. And she said, Donald, I don't understand what's the matter. And I said, well, it's just a matter of the fact that we need some children, and when that happens, everything will be okay. So we had a son and we had a daughter. And of course I drank all this time, and when our daughter was born on the 8th of December, 1945, I went up to the hospital to see her, and of course I was drunk when I got up there and embarrassed her, and she just shook her head and says, Donald, I don't understand what's the matter with you. And I said, there is nothing the matter with me. And she says, well, why are you drinking? I said, it's not my fault. And she said, if it's not your fault, whose fault is it? And I said, it's your fault. She said, why is it my fault? I said, you keep on getting pregnant and have on all these kids, loading me up with all this responsibility, and I'm not ready for it yet. So the poor woman just shook her head, and I said, besides, it's because I'm in the Air Force, and as you know, everybody in the Air Force drinks. So we got out of the Air Force. I said, I'll get out of the service and become a civilian, and don't worry, everything will be okay. And of course, I made these promises time after time. I got out of the service on the 8th of December, 1945, just shortly when my daughter was born. I got out the same month. I went back to my civilian occupation. At that time, was a news reporter in a daily newspaper. And everything went well for the first week or 10 days, and then one night one of the fellows in the city desk brought a pint of liquor to work. The following night another one did. Then it was my turn. And of course, being an alcoholic, not knowing it of course, but being an alcoholic, I had to do things bigger and better than anybody else. I brought a quart in. And so we polished that off the night desk, and I got home, I was drunk. And the next morning, of course, my wife looked at me and shook her head and says, Donald, I don't understand what's the matter with you. You said that the reason you drank is because you're in the Air Force, and now you're a civilian, you're still drinking. What is wrong with you? I said, there's nothing wrong with me. And she said, why are you drinking? I said, because I'm a newspaper man. I said, all those newspaper men are a bunch of drunks. You know that. They all drink. And so if I'm going to settle down, I've got to get away and change my environment. And I honestly believed that at the time. So we left Winnipeg and went to Toronto, miles away. And I became a salesman. Of course, when I wound up drunk being a salesman, it was because all salesmen drank. And then I struck this novel idea that if we could move to a small town where nobody knew us, everything would be different. See, I was under the impression that people in small towns didn't drink. So an opportunity arose in a small town in northern Ontario, Cobalt, Ontario, a small mining town. And I bought a grocery store up there and borrowed money, of course, and I knew that everything was going to be different. I told my wife, and this time when you come up, I'll go ahead, get everything going, and get a place to live. And when you come up with the children, don't worry, this time it's going to be different. And I honestly meant it at the time. And I said, when everything will be fine, I'll stop drinking. I'll be too busy to drink if I'm in my own business. So she came up a short time later in the bus, and I met the bus, and as she got off the bus, I was drunk. And of course, she was somewhat upset about that, and I said, don't worry. I said, it's because we're new in town, and you have to let these people see that you're sociable. But now that you're here, everything will be okay. And of course it wasn't. Things gradually got worse. In Christmas of 1947, we were visited by a pastor. And this man came to visit. He was talking to my wife and I, and when he left a parcel with me. And when I opened this parcel, in it was a book. And the book was entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the first edition of the big book. And I looked at that thing and I thought, my God, can you imagine? What an awful thing. And I turned to my wife and says, why do you think he left a book like this with me? And she says, he probably thinks you need it. And that did it. I threw the book into a corner and I said, I will never read that book as long as I live. And furthermore, if that bird ever sets foot inside this house again, I will bodily pick him up and throw him out, because all these priests and ministers are saying, they just prey on the emotions of old women and young children, and this religion is a lot of nonsense, and I'm just all done with it. And she just shook her head, and she didn't know what she was going to do. And she says, Donald, she says, I've had patients in the hospital that were called alcoholics, and they weren't nearly as bad as you get sometimes. And I says, my God, woman, what do I have to do to prove to you that I am not an alcoholic? She says, just go in the wagon and don't take a drink for a year. And I said, fine, you're on. And so I decided I would go in the wagon. I went all through Christmas and New Year, and I never took a drink. Now, mind you, I was very sanctimonious and self-righteous about it. I had my Christmas supply in. People would come over, and I'd offer them a drink, and they'd say, you're going to join us? And I'd say, no. And they'd say, well, come on, you're going to join us, surely. And I said, no, can't drink. And they said, why not? And I'd point to the kitchen where she was, and I'd say, her mother founded the Temperance Union, and she's a chip off the old block. They're not happy unless everybody else around them are miserable. But for the sake of the two children, I suppose that's a cross, one, that we men have to bear, and that sort of thing. But I'll carry on. Don't worry. You enjoy it. Have a drink. As I say, I went all through Christmas and New Year, very sanctimonious and self-righteous, and I knew I had this thing like now. And then it got into February, and I announced to her one day that on Saturday I said, I'm going to close the store a little early because I'm going up to Kirtland Lake. And she said, what for? And I said, I'm going to a meeting of the Legion. And she says, who with? And I told her, she says, Donald, you shouldn't go. And I said, why not? She said, well, they all drink so much, and you've been doing so well. And I said, now, wait a minute. I thought right away she just challenged me. I thought, here I've given up drinking for this woman, and now she's deciding to choose my friends. So I said, I'm going whether you like it or not. And, of course, at that point I hadn't really cared whether I did go to the meeting, but I just thought I was not going to let her wear the pants in my family, I'll tell you. So I said, no, I'm going. And so they picked me up that Saturday night, and we drove out of town. And we'd no sooner got out of town than one of them pulled out a bottle of Sandy McDonald's Scotch whiskey, and I can remember it vividly, as if it were yesterday. And the bottle came to me, and my thought process was something like this. Can you imagine her not trusting me? She thinks if I left home and went with these guys, I'd be drinking with them. And we're going to spend the night in Kirtland Lake, and she won't know whether I had a drink or not anyway, because I'll just have one. And besides, even if she did find out, though, it would serve her right, because, you see, she didn't trust me. Now, if you can follow that kind of logic, believe me, you're in the right place. So I took a good gulp, and down it went. And, nothing happened. And I thought, now, there it is. You see, I've been sober for a while. The war is behind me and everything else. That's been my trouble. I've been so, all those traumatic experiences and wartime and bad luck in civilian jobs, and that was my problem. Now I'm settled down, everything is fine, the bottle came out again, and I had another one, and of course another one. I never did get to the meeting that night. I got very drunk instead, and we got back home Sunday morning, and I was still half in the bag. And I went to pick up my wife and two children at the church meeting where they were to take them home, and embarrassed her, of course, no end. And in the meantime, by the way, on New Year's Day in 1948, I had a close friend, Hal Fleming, who was an alcoholic. He was a salesman. And he wound up in the hospital in Haileybury with the DTs. And while he was there, a clergyman went over to visit him, a pastor, and talked to Hal and asked him what he was doing there. And Hal said he was an alcoholic. And the pastor says, why don't you stop drinking? And Hal said, how do you do that? And he said, have you ever heard of AA? And Hal said, no. And he said, would you like to? And Hal said, anything. And so he brought Harry Jenkins over to see Hal. And Hal got out of that hospital bed never to take another drink again. And he died some 25 years later. But Hal had nothing better than do than 5 minutes after he was sober, they told him to find another drunk. He had nothing better to do than come over and see me. And I was sober. I was on the wagon. And he told me about him going to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I said, I didn't know anything about them. I said, that's wonderful, Hal, because, you were getting pretty bad, and I should have known because I was with them all the time. And he asked me if I'd like to attend a meeting, and I said, certainly not. I've got willpower. I can quit whenever I want. I just never made up my mind, but I said, I'm on the wagon now. And so I'd get rid of him quick because, I didn't want anybody seeing him hang around the store in case they thought that I knew him or was with them or something like that. So Hal used to bug me occasionally. Well, this Monday morning after the do in Kirkland Lake, when I'd been drunk, I got up, and instead of the finger wagging and the shaking of the head and the lecture that I used to get, nothing. This morning she was in the kitchen, and she was totally incommunicado. And I got out of bed very shakily, and I thought, boy, I've done it now. I went in the kitchen and tried to talk to her, and of course she wouldn't talk to me. Her back was to me. She absolutely refused. And I didn't know it then, but that was the morning that she had decided she was going to take the children and leave. And I say I didn't know that at the time, but I knew I was in hot water. You know, I just had that sixth sense. I told her one time, you know, that I had a sixth sense. And she says, Donald, I'm certainly glad you do, because you obviously lack the other five. And that was quite true also. But I knew I was in trouble. And of course, I decided I'd better go down open the store. And so shakily I started down the stairs, because we lived above the store. And I thought, oh my God, this is the morning I have to go and see the banker. And this banker was one of these characters who should have been a social worker, because any time I wanted to borrow money from him, he'd give me a lecture about drinking and all this sort of thing, instead of just giving me money. But if she went to see him, he'd give it okay the overdraft every time. But I knew she wasn't going to go and see the banker this morning. So I was in really trouble. There's two major problems, and I don't know what I'm going to do. Things can't get much worse. So I go downstairs, and I opened the store door. I went back and looked out, and I looked up, and who should come walking across the street but this idiot Hal Fleming from the A&A. I thought, oh, that's all you need. They say trouble comes in threes. Here it is. There's her, the banker, now this. And then Hal walks with a big smile on his face. He says, well, Don, are you still on the wagon? And I'm chewing a big wad of dentine gum, and I'm saying, yes, I am. And he said, well, I just thought that maybe you might like to come to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous with me to see what goes on. And of course, I didn't know it then, but the only time I ever chewed gum was the morning after, because, you know, when you're talking to customers, I had to cover up my breath. So everybody in town apparently knew it but me, that when they saw me chewing gum, they said, oh, he was out last night on a bender. So I said to Hal, when do you meet? And he said, on Friday night. I said, how long do the meetings last? He said, an hour. I said, how much does it cost? He says, it's free. And right away I was suspicious. I said, which church is behind? He said, no church. I said, what do you do? He said, we just sit around and talk. I said, what do you talk about? He said, we just talk about drinking and things like that. I said, that's all there is to it? And he said, that's all. I said, you know how, can I talk to you in confidence? And he said, yes. I said, you know, Hal, I got a brother that drinks quite a bit. Do you think I could go to one of those meetings with you and learn something about this thing, and I could help this brother of mine? And Hal, very wise, said, yes, I'm sure you could. I said, wait right here. And I shot up the back stairs into the kitchen. Her back was still to me. I said, Hal Fleming's downstairs. Nothing. I said, I'm going to go to one of those A&A meetings with him on Friday night. And that did it. She ran over and threw her arms around me. She says, oh, Donald, I'm so glad to hear you're finally going to do something about your drinking. I thought, boy, I got her now. So I said, will you go to the bank for me? She says, yes. What should I tell them? So I told her what to say to the bank. Now, can you imagine that? Just 30 minutes ago, 3 major problems in my life, and bing, bing, bing. For 30 minutes, it's all over. She's happy again. She's going to see the banker. All I got to do is go down and get rid of this character from the A&A, and everything will be fine. Settle down to work, back to normal. So I got downstairs, and I got rid of Hal very quick. I said, Hal, I'm very, very busy, but I'll go with you on Friday night. Don't worry, but you'll have to leave now. And so Hal left, and I thought, this is great. So I stayed sober Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Well, he's been sober a whole week. Who needs AA? So I got upstairs that evening. In fact, I closed the store a little early because I thought he was going to come over, but I knew now he had forgotten, so I thought, that's great. I closed the store a little early, pulled the blind down, went upstairs. And I'm sitting and having dinner at the table, and the phone rings, and it's Hal Fleming. And I thought, why does he have to phone right now, right in front of her and the kids, they can hear everything. So he starts talking about this meeting, and he said, we'll come over. I said, when does the meeting start, Hal? And he said, well, it's at 8 o'clock. And I said, good. I said, we can go up in one bus. And I said, where is it? He said, Haleybury. Yes, that's the next town. I said, good. We can go up in one bus and back in the next. Because I said, I'm very busy. That's 1 hour. He says, we don't have to go on the bus. He said, we'll come over and pick you up. One of the members is down here with his car. We'll come and pick you up. I said, please don't do that. That won't be necessary. Because I could just see that big white station wagon with Alcoholics Anonymous written on the side of it. You know, it'd be as bad as that. I mean, how could you be anonymous with a car that looked like that? You know, so I'd say, no, don't you come near here. Because I thought, my God, what would the neighbors think if they looked out and saw this car at my door? You know, it'd be a loudspeaker on the roof, you know, blaring out music, and there'd be some of these characters on the running board with long flowing robes and pigtails and bald heads, you know, and handing out pamphlets and flowers and saying how they'd all been saved. I knew nothing about Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, I'll come over to your place, Hal. And so I went out the back door with my coat collar up and my hat down, because I didn't, and up a back alley, because I didn't walk up the main street, because if I bumped into somebody and said, where are you going? You can't say you're going to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. What could you say? So I avoided everybody, went up this back alley, and every step was, it was terrible. I thought, how did I ever get involved in this? I am not an alcoholic. I don't want to be an alcoholic. I don't want to associate with alcoholics. And of course the classical one, even if I might be just a little bit alcoholic, this AA wouldn't work for me anyway, because you see, I'm different. And all my life I knew that I was different. See, I was such a sensitive person. Nobody had ever understood me. My own family, my teachers in school, nobody had ever really understood me. And if you had the sensitivity that I did, you would drink also. And so I didn't certainly want to associate with these characters. But they took me with them to that first meeting. And we walked in the door, and there was 4 other fellows there. Now, Terry I knew of, and he was manager of a lumber company, and I wondered what he's doing. I thought, I'll bet you this is the guy that's bankrolling this deal. And Harry was there, the court clerk, and I thought maybe the courts were worked up in some sort of a deal, but he said he was an alcoholic, but he couldn't be. He was clean, and he wore a suit and a tie and shirt and everything. And Hal was there, and Ernie. And so they sat me down, and they started telling in a general way what they used to be like and what happened. And as they were talking, I was identifying them, nodding my head. And then I figured it all out. What they've been doing is talk to her. She's told them all about me. You know, all this feeling of remorse the morning after and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, boy, when I get home, am I ever going to straighten her out? And then they went on and told some more of their stories, things that she didn't know anything about, and I wondered, how did they find that out about me? And finally I blurted it out. I said, how come you guys know so much about me? They said, oh, we're not talking about you, Don. We're talking about ourselves. And this is not a form of public confession, by the way. This is simply a projection of the basic symptoms of alcoholism. And I said, but I've done all those things too, and I'm not an alcoholic. And they all smiled at each other and just kept right on going as if I hadn't uttered a word. And you know, that was back in February 1948, and this is the first miracle, because I did not want to go to that meeting in the first place. It was the last place on earth I wanted to go. I did not want to quit drinking or anything else, and I was certainly no alcoholic. And that meeting started at 8 o'clock sharp on a button, and I didn't get home till 2:30 in the morning, because in those days an AA meeting lasted as long as it took them to convince the newcomer to come back to the next meeting. And so they had their work cut out. They went right till 2:30, and I got home, and Norma was still awake. And she said, how'd it go? And I said, well, I don't know, but the way these guys laid out, I'm going to try it and see what happens. But if you dare say one word to anybody in your family or in my family, I'm going to get drunk, and that'll be the end of it. And so don't you ever say a word to anybody. She said, don't worry, I won't. And so as time went on, I started going to meetings on a regular basis. And I didn't really know much about anything. But I'll tell you, when you see me standing here today, I'm not the person that went to the first conference. I can still vividly recall my first AA conference. And that first conference I attended was in 1949. It was just a little more than a year after I had joined Alcoholics Anonymous. And the conference was held in Montreal, Quebec. And it was held in the Mount Royal Hotel. It was the first Quebec conference. And some salesmen had come through town, and they said that I ought to attend, and the others should go. And I remember saying to Hal and Harry, "You guys going down to the conference?" And they said, "We might." And I says, "Could I get a ride down with you?" And they said, "No. But if you happen to get there, we'll see that you get a ride back." Because I don't think they believed I was ever going to make it because of my age. I was only 26 at the time, and there was nobody under 40 or 50 came into Alcoholics Anonymous. And so they said if I made it, so I went home and I told Norma that they thought I should go to this thing. And so she gave me $10, and she went over across the street and bought a piece of material, and she made a pair of pajama pants for me and a T-shirt, and all I had was my Air Force knapsack and this $10, and I got out on the road and I hitchhiked from Haileybury down to Montreal because I didn't have any money for bus fare or anything else. I didn't have any decisions to make, by the way, in those days. If you're new, I should warn you. If you don't like making decisions, don't hang around AA, because you're going to be faced with a lot of them. Because coming to this conference today, or this weekend, I had a lot of decisions to make. My wife and I had to decide which car to take. I never had a problem like that at the first conference. I didn't own a car. This morning I had a choice of which suit to wear. I didn't have that problem back then in 1949. I didn't own a suit. And so I had this sweater and trousers and a shirt. And down I went to Montreal, and of course I couldn't stay at the Mount Royal, but I stayed at the YMCA because it was only $1 a night in those days. And I stayed at the YMCA and I walked across to this conference. And I was so utterly amazed. There was such a huge crowd of people, about half the number that are in this room this morning. And I'd never seen so many people all at once, and it was hard to believe that they were all alcoholics. And as the buses came along and took us up in the afternoon to Mount Royal, atop Mount Royal, because Mayor Camille Hood, the mayor of Montreal at that time, and the city council had decided to have a high tea as welcoming the members of Alcoholics Anonymous to Montreal. And when we were up there, we're in this room waiting, and I stood back with my back against the wall, wondering about this, and this big tall fellow came over and stuck out his hand and shook my hand, and he asked me what my name was, and I told him. And he had these sort of blue-gray eyes, you know, that look right through you, just like some of those commanding officers we had during the Second World War. And the only thought that crossed my mind, as I can recall at the time, was, don't lie to this guy, he can read your mind. And I thought, boy, I'm not going to lie. He talked about, you know, how I'd come into Alcoholics Anonymous and so on and so forth. And then his wife came along and introduced me to her. She was a charming lady, Lois. And then the festivities started, and he said, I'll talk to you later. And he had to move up to the table, and he was introduced as Bill W., the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course I wasn't aware of it at the time. There's some wonderful things happened to me from then on. I got to know him much better and had many opportunities to spend time with him. And all I did, they told me in Alcoholics Anonymous in those days, was you reached out your hand in love and service. And you asked me to come along with you and walk one day at a time. And they said, you know, you'll begin to feel clean inside, and good things will happen in your life. And of course, that's all I have done. And on page 83 and 84 of our big book, it has the promises. And I can stand before you this morning and tell you that every single one of those promises have come true in my life, have been fulfilled beyond my wildest dreams. There's so many things that go on, I realize now, that we knew but so little in the beginning about Alcoholics Anonymous. I was reminiscing this morning at the table. I can recall shortly after I was sober, we used to go out and beat the bushes for any kind of a drunk we could find and drag them in. And I remember one time we were called up to New Liskeard. The two boys came down and said their mother and father's drunk. Would we come and talk to them? And we went up, and he was manager of an ice cream plant up there, the Upland Ice Cream Plant. So we talked to Bill and Hilda and told them when the meeting was. And so that meeting night, Bill and Hilda drove down from Lisker to Haileybury, and they came over to our house because they knew where I lived. And they said, we'll go to the meeting. And so I said to Hilda, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm going to the meeting with Bill. And we said, but this is a closed meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. You can't go to the meeting. And she says, but I'm an alcoholic. And we said, you can't be. And she says, why can't I be? We said, you're a woman. They don't have women alcoholics. And now this has nothing to do, by the way, with male chauvinism, as one of the gals in our group one day said. And I said, boy, she's a real chauvinist. We just didn't know. It was sheer ignorance. We did not know there was such a thing as a woman alcoholic. And so we said, no, Hilda, you can't come. And so we made her stay at home with Norma and talked to Norma while we went to the meeting. And then after the meeting, some of us came over to the house, and we had another private little meeting just for Hilda. Because you see, what happened was that, with our luck, the only female in the world that's the alcoholic has come to our group. And if headquarters ever find out about it, we'll be excommunicated or whatever they do to groups in Alcoholics Anonymous. We just didn't know, the abysmal ignorance. We didn't know what would happen. So we had meetings privately for a number of weeks with Hilda. And God bless her, in spite of us, she stayed sober. And she had over 25 years of sobriety, as did her husband before they died. But these are things that happened out of ignorance we did not know. There's things they did in those days. My sponsor came over and they told my wife from now on that he's joined Alcoholics Anonymous. From now on, you better start making desserts with the meals. And she says, but he never eats desserts. And they said, no alcoholic does for some reason or other. We don't know why, but once they get sober, they're going to eat desserts. And that was absolutely true. To this day, I will eat a meal just to get to the dessert. That's the main part of any meal. We never knew what those things were. We didn't know why that was. And we went in a 12-step call, and we always had some candy bars in our pockets and some Cokes. And they'd say, what do we do before you guys come back again if we get thirsty, take a drink? We say, eat a candy bar and drink a Coke. And don't worry about it and call. And you keep eating the candy bars and drink the Cokes till we come over. And we did that. We didn't know why it worked. And it's only, would you believe, since 1980 that we've discovered why that is. And that's a long list, all this time that AA has been going on. The geneticists have discovered, in about 1980 it was, they've discovered that what it is that we do, it's a physical sensitivity to alcohol. And the best way to try and describe it is we all drive automobiles today. We all know how important it is the oil level, the oil reservoir in our car must be, we use a dipstick and we dip the stick into that oil reservoir, and it must be right in the middle of the safe area. If you change the oil yourself and put too much oil in your car, and it's above the safe area, you can't drive your car with too much oil in it because you'll blow a seal. I think you all know that. And so before you drive, you must let some of that oil out, because a car is a mechanical thing, and you must bring it down to the safe area. On the other hand, if you drive your car and the oil gets way down low, below the safe area, and you ignore the warnings, you keep on driving until there's practically no oil left, then you know that all of a sudden there's going to be a loud thunk and that engine will seize up completely. And that's because of lack of oil. The human body has something in a way that's similar in a way to the oil reservoir in a car. It's called a blood sugar level. And the blood sugar level fluctuates up and down. Now, and the difference is when the blood sugar level gets so high, there's a little valve opens, whatever it does, spills something out in the system as waste. However, there are certain people, and it doesn't matter whether they're male or female, young, old, rich, poor, it doesn't matter what your race, color, creed, or anything else. There's a certain percentage of people that have a malfunction at this upper level. They take the blood sugar level rises, and there's quite a pressure created. The first thing you know, they will faint, pass out, and go into a coma. They're carted off to the hospital and diagnosed as being diabetic. And from that point on, from their diagnosis, they must be treated for diabetes. And they're told they must use a special diet, or take insulin. I have no trouble understanding this because my father-in-law was a diabetic, and he had to give himself a needle in the thigh every day of insulin to survive. And so it's not their fault. You don't tell the diabetic to just pray harder and it'll go away and all that stuff, but you just, because of that malfunction, and it's through no fault of their own. On the other hand, when the blood sugar level drops too low, with most people, a little valve or something opens and some carbohydrate comes into the system and it brings it back up to normal. But like the diabetics, there are certain people, the blood sugar level, because of a malfunction, when it keeps going down, that person has a lot of problems. And a person with that problem is called an alcoholic. They have also discovered that that malfunction has nothing to do with willpower or anything else. The geneticists now call that a biochemical genetic disorder, and that means it is hereditary. They have even gotten it down now to the points where they can tell you that if two non-alcoholics are married and they have a child, that there's not, very good chance the child will be normal. If one of those two parents is alcoholic, that there's a 35 times greater chance the child will become alcoholic. If there are both parents are alcoholic, there's a 400 times greater chance that the child will become an alcoholic. Now, these are not statistics from AA or anything else. These are from the geneticists, and that is a biochemical genetic disorder, so it is hereditary. I have no trouble believing that because, of course, I've told you, my father was a practicing alcoholic and I had an older brother. Then there are those of us in AA who says, but my parents never took a drink. All you have to do is like other heredity features. If your parents don't have it, go back a generation or two and you'll find either a grandparent or a great-grandparent had exactly the same thing, because sometimes it will skip. Now that is the physical sensitivity to alcohol, and that's called the biochemical genetic disorder. And so if we have that, we have to accept it. People have said, but with a car, that's a poor analogy, because with the car, when that oil level starts going down, you get lots of warning. A red light will come on your dash, the oil pressure will drop, the oil temperature will go up, and the next thing you know, somebody will say, I smell something burning. You say, oh, don't worry about it, we're going by a dump. And you say, but it's getting warm in here. You say, oh, that's just the sun and the air conditioning isn't working too well. You ignore all the warning signs, and of course, there'll be a loud thunk and the engine seizes up. I, as an alcoholic, get lots of warning. When that blood sugar level starts to drop, I get all the warning signs. Things go, I start getting sweaty palms. I'll start pacing up and down. Get nervous, open cupboard doors and close them, and somebody will say, what are you looking for? And they'll say, nothing. Close it and open another door, and my wife come over. So, Donald, if there's something you're looking for, let me know and I'll help you. I'd say, for God's sakes, woman, excuse me, can't I look in a cupboard here? I live in this house. But if you tell us what you're looking for, I'm not looking for anything. Well, why are you opening cupboard doors? I think, my God. I've had a terrible day at work. I work for the lousiest boss in the world. I come home, and instead of getting some understanding, all I get is nag, 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 nag. And these kids are driving me crazy. Can't you do something about them? So she'll gather up the kids, and I'll say, leave Daddy alone. We better go out for a little walk and then settle down. So I plump down in my chair, and I pick up a book to read or magazine, and look at that. Oh, that's nothing. And look around. Where's everybody gone? Where is she? Where are the kids? They don't care. That's the whole problem with this marriage. They don't give a damn about me, or they never have cared, and nobody loves me. That's the story of my life. I know I felt terrible. For a long time as a child growing up, I thought I had been adopted. I'm serious. I had a real perception problem from the day that I was born. I did not perceive things the way, quote, normal people perceived them. I would come home from school and rush up to my father with a piece of paper, drop my bicycle outside, and come in and say, Dad, guess what happened in school today? And he'd reach his hand out, gently place it on my shoulder and say, Donald, how many times have we told you, please don't drop your bicycle in the middle of the sidewalk. Put it on the rack we made for it, out of the way, and close the screen door, the flies are coming in. That's what he said. But my perception, I thought about it for a minute. What he's saying, really, what he means is, Donald, you know, you've got 5 older sisters and an older brother, and this was a wonderful family till you came along and screwed it all up. You know, we're sorry you were ever born. It's too bad you've done this to the family. Why don't you just get out of our lives and leave us alone? So I would skulk out of the house. I never perceived what other people perceived. I could be sitting in a place and somebody would turn around and say, wasn't that a nice suit that Ed was wearing last night? And I'd say, well, what was the matter with my suit? And they say, oh, wait a minute now, we weren't talking about your suit. We said that had a nice suit that Ed had on. I say, why the hell shouldn't he wear a nice suit? He's a lawyer. If I had his clothes or money, I'd buy clothes like that too. I was very defensive and uptight all the time. And of course, this is a perception problem. I had that long before I got to AA. I've had that all my life. So these are some of the problems I faced. The other thing they told me I learned about in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know some may not like this, but that's the physical sensitivity to alcohol. We now know what it is. The other 2 problems is that we are emotionally and spiritually. Now, if there's newcomers in the room, I'll tell you we're emotionally and spiritually handicapped. Now, the newcomers can plug your ears so we won't offend you, but really what it means is we are retarded emotionally and spiritually. As a small child, I grew up. Mentally and physically, I kept on growing. Emotionally and spiritually, I was retarded. My growth stopped very early in life. You know, normal growth for children as a baby, they're very dependent. And then we reach the teen years and we become independent. And then they reach adulthood and they become interdependent. Alcoholics don't know what the word interdependent means. We grow up as dependent, then we're independent, and at the age of 18 or 21, whenever it is supposedly adulthood, we're still independent. 31 years of age, we're still independent. And 41, we're still independent. All that does is advertise to everybody how retarded we are. And so, you know, the problem with this retardation, emotionally and spiritually, if I were physically retarded, if, like, you know, the thalidomide baby or something else, or a missing arm, or if I was missing an arm, it's obvious to everybody here that I have a handicap, and you would make allowances for it. If I was after the meeting, was going to help with the chairs, and I only have one hand, some of the guys jump up and say, here, Don, we'll give you a hand. They make allowances for it. They know it's not my fault, but they don't bother me. They accept it. The same thing if I was a mongoloid, I had a mental handicap, and I was trying to write my name on the board, and somebody said, oh, hurry up. Somebody else would nudge him and say, leave him alone. He's doing very well for where he's at. And you'd make allowances for that because it's obvious. The problem with emotional and spiritual handicap, if the alcoholic keeps his mouth shut, that's the secret. If they can keep their mouth shut, they can sneak by and look as if they're normal. And that's the whole problem. People do not comprehend that we are retarded. And this is why normal people, you know, enter into interpersonal relationships. Alcoholics don't. We take hostages. She is mine. By God, and that's it. I have never known an alcoholic yet who knew how to give or receive love in a normally accepted manner. I certainly didn't. All my life, growing up, I never knew that I was in love or in heat. It's that simple. And I say that in all sincerity. I honestly didn't know what love was. It's a learning experience I had to learn in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I discovered that my emotions were at fault. I was emotionally handicapped. If you drew a straight line, you could call this total emotional control. But there are only about 15% of the inhabitants of North America are even capable of practicing total emotional control because it is an absolute. For example, a good example would be many of you can remember Nadia Comaneci, the Romanian gymnast. She is one of the few people that had total emotional control. When she was doing her performance, her routine, if she slipped for any reason on the high bar or the horse or anything like that, she would never even flicker an eyelash. Carry on as though nothing had happened, and she'd strut off the floor and stand and wait. until her score was posted, and then strut off into the gym where her coach was, and then, when she was off camera, then she would either have tears because she didn't get the score she wanted, she would allow her emotions to show, or she'd hug her coach with a big smile and everything else. And that is total emotional control. Most people have an emotional level like this. It goes up and down. They feel good, and then something will happen, they'll feel a little bad. And then they feel good, they'll feel bad. And alcoholics' emotions are up like this. I never felt good. It was sheer ecstasy. Just fantastic. And then something would happen, and down I'd come. Not feeling bad, away down here, suicidal depression. This is terrible. And then back up again, something way up here. Up and down like a toilet seat at a mixed party. That's the emotional level that I had. And this was always like that. My emotions were either over or under amplified. And when you know what I'm talking about, if I stood back like this, if I stood back, that's under amplification. If I got up too close, you see how everybody jokes? That's the way an alcoholic's emotions are. We learn in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous how to cut down those highs and raise those bottoms and start living a normal life. But Ed said it last night. We will never be normal. However, we can act as if we were normal, and we can sneak by and nobody will ever know it. The spiritual part, of course, and they say the spiritual part of the program, and I don't think it's a part of it. It is a spiritual program, period. It tells us in the big book why that book was written. I say I was an agnostic because I really was an agnostic. I didn't believe in anything. I can remember as a child going to Sunday school, and they told me these stories about the carpenter a couple of 1,000 years ago who rode around the country in a donkey. And he made a lame man walk, and he made a blind man see. And I thought, you know, he did that, this character, and he said it wasn't him, really, it wasn't his power, it was God, his Father, who was able to do this. He just had this faith. And I never had faith, of course, and I never could understand why till I got into Alcoholics Anonymous. Because, see, I grew up learning never to trust my parents, any adults, or anybody else. It wasn't until I got to Alcoholics Anonymous and was in it for quite some time before I began to trust someone else, my sponsors. And of course, trust is the beginning of faith. If you cannot have trust in another human being, it's impossible to have faith in a power greater than yourself. And so this is the great gift that Alcoholics Anonymous has given to me. It taught me to trust someone else. And once I learned to trust someone else, that trust was the beginning of faith. Because I used to say, you know, if there was a God, he'd perform a miracle today that I could witness with my own eyes. But there have been no miracles, so therefore there can't be any God. And yet when you stop and look around, all it requires is some plain, ordinary common sense. Just plain, ordinary common sense. There has to be some form of intelligence in this universe. There has to be. Because as long as I have been alive, the sun has risen every morning and set every night. There have been the stars in the sky. What keeps them there? We have the temperature changes, the seasons, and I used to wonder about that. As I live in Fargo, Moorhead, Fargo, North Dakota, and of course they all make fun. Johnny Carson's always making fun of Fargo, the coldest spot in the world, or at least United States. And we say, why is that? We have such cold winters. And you stop and think and say, really, that's God's handiwork. Because that Fargo Moorhead area is called the Red River Valley. And that dark, black soil of the Red River Valley will produce anything that's planted. They grow potatoes there. They grow sugar beets. They grow wheat. They grow sunflowers, anything. And of course that cold winter is what provides, and all that snow, what provides the moisture to give that soil its fertility that it requires. And that's part of this higher powers plan. Because I look at other things and I say, why is it? The only product of pure sunshine is a desert. And nothing can survive in a desert like that. We can't grow things in the desert. And so there's a plan for everything, and this power in this universe. And I used to say, you know, if I could see a miracle, I could believe in this God. And you know, there's miracles are happening every day all around us, and I was just too dumb to even know it. For many, many years, people used to wonder about the swallows in Capistrano. They used to take off a certain day every year and head south, and they flew down to Argentina, Buenos Aires, and they'd winter there, and then they'd come back to California, and they always arrived at the same place, same time. And for years and years and years, people have been amazed at that. How can that be? That has to be some sort of miracle. The other thing that puzzled them, though, and they had arguments for many, many years, how could those birds who get tired so easily fly across that great expanse of ocean without getting tired? Why didn't they fall into the ocean and drown? And it wasn't until just a few short years ago, there were a couple of ornithologists down on the southern coast when the swallows were going by, and they noticed a remarkable thing. Those swallows from Capistrano landed just prior to taking off to fly over the ocean. And as each one landed, they'd pick up a little twig in their feet, and they'd fly off and head south. And when they got tired, they would come down close to the water, they'd drop the little twig, then they'd land on the twig, and they would rest. And when they'd had enough rest, their feet would close in the little twig, and off they'd go further south. And that's how they've been going back and forth. So somebody tells me, how can you explain that sort of thing, other than it being a miracle? This is not something that man can do at all. This is something in this universe that nature looks after, and this God of our understanding. Another thing, I was reading one time an article by a geneticist, and he was the president of the New York Academy of Sciences. And the title of the article was Why Men of Science Believe in God. And he was talking about our genes, not our blue genes, but our genes. And he was saying that our genes are the source of all human behavior. All human behavior. And yet, if you took all the genes, these genes are so tiny, so small. If you took all the genes from all the people in the world today, they would only fill a thimble. Now, to me, that is unbelievable. How can that be? It's a source of all human behavior. We know that there are 5 billion human souls on the face of the earth, and there's no two sets of fingerprints the same. How do we account for that? That's another miracle. There are miracle upon miracle happening every day in every way around us. And all we do in Alcoholics Anonymous, these people told me, is to open your eyes, and you have to do certain things. And of course, I didn't have much education when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, but I was blessed with some wonderful sponsorship. They were very kind, they were very tolerant, and they taught me many things. I can recall my sponsor one time, we were at a meeting, and they asked for questions, and I didn't put up my hand. And after the meeting, I was full of questions to him, asked him this and that. And he says, Don, why didn't you ask those questions at the meeting when it came out? And I said, well, I didn't want to appear foolish. And I'll never forget, he just looked at me and he says, Don, a wise person asks questions and appears foolish for a few moments. A fool never asks a question and remains a fool all his life. And so I didn't want to be a fool. I've never been afraid to ask a question from that point on. The other thing they told me was that I had a problem with honesty. I had to get honest with myself. And I says, oh, well, yeah, I can do that. And my sponsor again says, do you know the definition of honesty? The true definition. And I said, well, you know. And he said, yes, I know, but do you? And I said, well, you know, that's a dumb question. Oh, everybody knows what honesty is. And so he just wrote it out. We're having lunch, and he wrote it out on the placemat. He says, honesty is the total absence of any intent to deceive. Because, you see, I'm the kind of person who would put if my wife gave me a letter to mail, I'd put it in my pocket, come home from work, and I was coming in the door, I thought, oh, my God, I forgot the letter. Well, I won't say anything. And again, she said, Donald, did you mail my letter this morning? And I'd look at her and I'd say, what do you think I did with it? She says, did you mail my letter? I says, my God, woman, I go out of this house every morning, right down past the post office to the office. And she said, did you mail my letter? I said, do you remember the other night we were wondering what's wrong with our marriage? You don't trust me. You never have from the day we were married. I says, you don't even trust me to do a simple thing like mail a letter. And she says, well, I'm sorry I asked. I said, you should be. And I'd go and sit in my easy chair and pick up the newspaper. Now, I never lied to her. If she wanted to jump to the conclusion that I had mailed her letter, that's her problem, not mine. And, of course, in AA, they shot that down by giving me a definition of honesty. The other one that I had a great deal of problem with was humility, because they told me that I was a product of self-will run riot. And they said the only antidote, well, I guess the best description of an alcoholic is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex, and that's what I was. And they said the only way to get over this is to practice humility. And I said, well, I don't know if I can do that or not, because I did not know the difference between humility and humiliation. And again, they were very tolerant, and I was taught that humility is not thinking less of me. It's thinking of me less. Start thinking of other people just for a change. Place them first. And of course we have, and this is our major problem, and to practice humility, we are given an opportunity in Alcoholics Anonymous like no other organization I know of in the world. We have the opportunity to work with newcomers, and we must continually do that at all times, because that helps us to think of others instead of ourselves. And I think, too, looking back at my alcoholism, it's very similar to another condition I was familiar with at the time I got to AA, and this is the condition known as body odor, BO. And the reason I say my AA was like BO is because I was the last person in town to find out that I had it. Another thing like BO, I resented any reference to it by my family or friends. Another thing, I was only comfortable with other people like myself. And of course, the best reason of all is that there is no known cure in the world today. Medical science, as great as it is, have not yet come up with a cure for either body odor or for alcoholism. However, there is successful treatment for both conditions. Now, if it's body odor, successful treatment is regular bathing with soap and water. But remember, it must be done on a regular basis to be effective. And so it is the best treatment for alcoholism is regular attendance at meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. But it must be done on a regular basis to be effective. And I've had people say to me, but Don, you go to so many meetings. Yes, I go to a lot of meetings. I averaged 3 or 4 a week when I came in some 39 years ago. I still average 3 or 4 a week. And that's because I've been given this opportunity to work with others. And then people say to me, but you like those meetings so much. I said, who said I liked them? They said, you must like them. You go to so many. I said, it has nothing to do with liking them. And they look puzzled, and they say, what do you mean? I said, it's like bathing and shaving. You mean to tell me because I bathe and shave every day that I must love shaving and bathing? Not one bit. But you know, I have 6 grandchildren, 4 granddaughters and 2 grandsons. And they come up to me and they throw their arms around me and hug me and kiss me and they say, Grandpa, you smell so good. And the girls in our group, you know, will come up after me and say, Don, give me a hug. And it doesn't matter to me whether 19, 29, 49. We have one in our group, 83. I always give Jean a hug. She says, Don, you smell so good. I bathe and shave not because I like bathing and shaving, but I love the effect it produces in my life. And so it is with meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. It doesn't mean I like meetings, but I love the effect they produce in my life. And so these are the things that happen. We learn in Alcoholics Anonymous. And as we go on, I think of all the other things that can happen to us. And over the years, I think how fortunate I have been. And I've seen so many changes and witnessed so many miracles in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, the greatest miracle of all was my own life. Because I say when I arrived here, just before coming to Alcoholics Anonymous, my mother died. And I went home to the funeral. And I met my older brother. And the one time a mother and 5 sisters need their sons and they need their brothers. He and I got drunk, and we embarrassed my mother and embarrassed my sisters. They'd wished we hadn't gone to the funeral. And I think there I was, a failure as a son and a failure as a brother. And when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, new people reached out your hand to me. I was living in a house, but it wasn't a home. The business I was in was on the verge of bankruptcy. I had a wife, but she certainly didn't have a husband. I had 2 children, but they certainly didn't have a father. And all these things that had happened. And I'm the one who is agnostic, who didn't believe in this power. And as time went by, because they had told, I used to think if there was a miracle performed, I could believe it. And as time went by, even though I missed out on a lot of the other miracles, one occurred in my own life. Because I've seen the program of Alcoholics Anonymous give a woman a husband, and it gave 2 children a father, and it turned a house into a home, because a house is simply a building. A home is where there's warmth and love and communication. And I look at the other things that have happened. Shortly after I got sober, we conned my big brother into coming to a meeting, and he came, and when we got him softened up, ready for him, he said, "When is the meeting?" We said, "Tonight." And so I left him with them, we ran up and made the phone call, we got everybody together, and we had a meeting that night. And he went back home to British Columbia, and he had 16 years of sobriety in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous before he died of natural causes. So I saw this program give back a woman not 1 son, but 2 sons. And these 5 sisters were given back not 1, but 2 brothers. So you see, there was a miracle that happened, right there before my very eyes. I was part of it. And I have been privileged to witness to many, many miracles in the programs of AA and Al-Anon and Alateen. This has got to be the greatest thing that has ever happened to me, and to countless others. And I think of all these things, and there may be some newcomers here today who said, "Yes, Don, that's all right for you. I've been told it." They say, "There you are standing up there. You obviously have a good job. You've got good clothes. You drive a good car. How come it's all you people are well off say that this is the program?" I should point out that I was a bum when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. For 9 years we did not have a car at all, because I had some $13,000 in debt, and my sponsors made me pay back every penny. And so I had to do that. Our 2 children were in high school before they got their first store-bought clothes, because Norma had to make over things for them. And yet one time when I was talking at an AA meeting, I had made mention, and our son and daughter were attending that meeting. And I made mention of the fact that as growing up, that I had deprived our children of so much. And the next day was a Sunday, it was a Saturday night meeting, and the next day my son and daughter got me in the room and they said, "Dad, there's something we want you to understand. We wish you would stop saying in AA that you deprived your children of anything. We have never felt deprived." And I never realized that. And they said, "We just didn't think you made as much money as other people." And that never bothered us. We had lots of wonderful things in our home that a lot of other kids never had. So don't ever say that, because that's not a true story. And so I thank both those kids, and I think how wonderful it is to have a family like that. And then people say, "How can this happen to me?" And I can tell you easily, I had 2 great attributes coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. I had advantage over many people. I was dumb and I was broke. And the reason I say those were advantages, I've never met anyone yet too dumb to understand the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and get sober and stay sober. I have never met anyone yet that was too broke to get this program and stay sober. But I have met many who are far too well educated to understand this program. They continually analyzed it instead of utilizing it. And of course that was the failure, and that's the problem. And I met many people who've had far too much money to get this program, to get sober and stay sober. So you see, if you're dumb and you're broke, those are great advantages. And the other thing says, what do I specifically have to do? And it's very simple. The whole thing is in a nutshell. And it's right on page 164 of our big book of experience, Alcoholics Anonymous. Now a quote. How does this all come to pass? How can this miracle happen to me as well as anyone else? And it says in the last paragraph, quote, abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then. Thank you.